Hi guys, my name is Rohan. I'm going to be a junior at the college. I'm studying government, and I'm going to be the director for the Security Council at HMUN India this year. This is my first time coming to HMUN India. I'm very excited to be a director and very excited to see what the conference is like and very excited to meet all of you. Um, Today's topic is the importance of public speaking in Model UN. But before we get started on that, are there any questions about how this is going to work? The webinar is going to last about an hour. As to the guy who says, can you help me with Sakyum, I will definitely be able to help you with that. Most of the advice I'm giving is applicable to all of the committees across the board. So any questions before we get started, you can go ahead and just type them in the chat if you have questions. And thank you to whoever blessed me after I sneezed. Very nice of you. Alright, we're just going to get started with that, seeing no questions. So in Model UN, success is dependent on your participation, and it depends on two forms of participation. As for specific questions in Security Council, how about you save the committee-specific questions till later in the webinar, and we'll get to those. Okay? Yeah. So anyway, public speaking Model UN, your success is ultimately determined by your participation, and there are two forms in which you can participate in most committees. There's your in-committee participation and your out-of-committee participation. So your in-committee participation is what we're going to be talking about mainly today. So that includes, your speeches, any kind of parliamentary procedure that you do, that sort of stuff. And your out-of-committee participation is your research, your caucusing, writing resolutions and directives, leading blocks, in some cases, crisis notes. And so you need to do well in both of these elements to do well in Model UN. However, you have very little control on what your out-of-committee participation looks like to the chair. They're busy looking at the rest of the committee. They might not get a lot of time to see you necessarily. They may be trying to keep track of a lot of people, and you don't know what that's going to look like. You do, however, have a lot of control on how your chair looks at you during your in-committee participation, because when you're speaking, when you're proposing a motion, you're going to have their full and undivided attention. And so when you have that attention, you need to make sure you're making the most of it, which is very important. And this is also important in establishing yourself as a driving force in committee to both the chair and the other delegates, so that they understand that, okay, this is someone we want to work with, this is someone we want to caucus with and compromise with to try and get something pushed forward. More importantly, effective communication is vital to getting your points across and driving debate, which is the ultimate goal of Model UN, having good spirited discussion, getting something out of it. And this debate forum is also the best opportunity in which to present your ideas and showcase your research, which hopefully you've done. And so speaking well also will makes the chair notice you more, have other delegates hold you in higher esteem and want to work with you. So that's very important. And that's kind of the preface for everything I'm saying, the reason why public speaking is important, and it's important to communicate your ideas well in Model UN. Can everyone understand me and hear me? Am I speaking too fast or anything? Just taking a quick pause. Just everyone type a quick yes, no, something in the chat if it's going well. All fine? Great. So moving on, there are two main kinds of speeches that I want to talk to you about today. The first is an introduction. So introductions do, as they say, introduce, They introduce a new topic for discussion if, like you're saying, like, we should talk about this, or we should be discussing this, whether that's setting the topic, setting the agenda, something like that, or just discussing a new area you wish to steer conversation to. They also can be a call to take action. You could introduce, we've been discussing the problem of human trafficking at length now. It's time to talk about a concrete solution, an international framework, whatever. And so introductions typically come at the beginning and the end of a moderated caucus. It usually is the beginning where you're saying, this is the purpose of the moderated caucus, I want to talk about this. Or if they're coming towards the end, they often come in the form of, okay, we just talked about this, it's time to move towards this solution. And so those are really important for kind of setting the agenda for the discussion and the tone for how debate is going to go. So a good introductory speech will have three elements, and these elements are first the exposition, which is setting the scene for the new idea, like whether it's referring back to what other people were talking about or discussing the kind of international situation that leads you to discuss this new topic or call for this action. So exposition could be something like, recognizing the grave nature of the situation in Syria, or like, now that we've discussed nuclear proliferation at length, we should be discussing blank. And then you can move on to the presentation part of your speech, and that's where you actually present the idea. So you say, like, because we've done that, after you've done the exposition, we should do this. This is your specific ask. So that's what you're saying. We should be talking about what is going on in Ecuador, or we should be taking concrete action to limit ISIS, And then finally, you move on to your rationale, which is your just explanation for why this is important, why this is a good idea, after you've set it up with your exposition and presented the idea. So, why should we discuss this? Why is this idea any good? Why should we take this action that I'm proposing? As to the question, there will be a recorded version of this later on, so if you are having some issues with the internet or whatever, it will be available online for broadcast later. I'm just going to type that. And I think because it's hard to keep track of questions while I'm speaking, what we'll do is I'll just get through my speech, and then we'll do like general questions about the webinar, and then we'll do another set of just general questions about Model UN, and I will answer all of those towards the end. Does that sound good? Alrighty. Anyway, so I just went over introductions, and just to do a quick recap, introductions introduce a new topic for discussion or a call to take action. They're typically at the beginning or the end of a moderated caucus, and have three main elements. The exposition, which is where you set the scene for your new idea. The presentation, where you actually say what the idea is, what you're calling for, what you want to discuss. And then your rationale for that idea, which is why we should discuss this, why is this idea any good, why we should take this action. So the second kind of speech is a rebuttal. And usually those are responses to ideas or actions proposed by another delegate, or responding to a challenge from another delegate to your own idea or action. And these are typically the middle speakers in a moderated caucus. And an element of a good rebuttal is usually starts with a summary, which is where you explain what the point that you're challenging or rebutting is, reminding the audience of the focus of your speech, like whether that's calling out a specific delegate. Like, I just like to respond to the comments of Latvia on my proposal to stop global warming, or saying, the delegate has brought up the idea that we should increase military funding in this situation. And you can then, present the stuff like that. And so then what you want to do is move towards invalidation. You want to say, why is their point erroneous? Why is it unsound? Why are you challenging it? And you got to explain what is wrong with that. And that's very important, that you're not just like saying, I don't like that idea because I don't like that guy and he makes me mad or something, It has to be, logically argued out within your country's position or within the context of the debate why specifically you disagree with that point. And then furthermore, it's very important that you propose a counterpoint. It's one thing just to continually point out what's wrong with other people's points, but unless you propose an alternative, you're not really moving the debate anywhere. You're just kind of stalemating people when someone says, here's my idea, and you say, no, that's a bad idea. If you're saying it's a bad idea, that's fine. You just have to explain it, and you must also propose an alternative, which makes sense. Okay, so just another quick recap. The two major kinds of speeches in Model UN are introductions, which introduce new topics for discussions or calls to take action that are typically at the beginning or end of a moderated caucus, and have three elements: exposition, setting the scene for the new idea; presentation, which is where you explain the idea, and your rationale, in which you explain why exactly your idea or your call to action is important. The second kind of speech is a rebuttal, which is a response to an idea or an action proposed by another delegate or a challenge to one of your own ideas or actions. These are typically the middle speakers in moderated caucus, and these also have three elements. The summary, where you remind the audience the focus of your speech. Invalidation, where you explain what is wrong with that point, why the other delegate's point is erroneous or unsound. And then the counterpoint, where you explain how you fix this error or what the better alternative is, where you can pivot to another specific action. So it's important, though, regardless of what kind of speech it is, all good speeches have a certain number of elements that are consistent throughout. And so we're going to go through some of those now. One of the most important elements of a good speech is a clear position. Like you shouldn't have a speech where you're just sort of summarizing, what's been going on or just sort of presenting research. It should always take a strong position on an issue and have a point to it, so to speak. It's more than just saying, yeah, I agree with what this delegate said. I also agree with that delegate. I kind of agree with this delegate. I don't really agree with that delegate. Or like in my research, I found that like polar bears are dying, or just something random like that. A good speech always has a clear position, and it shouldn't just be a summary. It should always advocate for or against something. And once you have that position, you kind of have placed a marker in the ground for where debate is going, because then every other delegate can react to that position, voicing their support, challenging it, building upon it, or trying to break it down. And that's how debate keeps going. So you should be very important. It's very important that when you give a speech, you're actually taking a position and you're not just sort of, sitting there speaking for the sake of speaking. All right? So the next thing is memorability. Every time you speak, the speech should be getting remembered. Delegates should be referencing it. Other delegates should be commenting on it, way after you've spoken, and the chair should also be remembering it. And so what are the different ways to ensure that your speech is memorable? One technique that we often use on Harvard's team is the first sentence, last sentence technique. Though the chair is usually listening when you're talking, sometimes other delegates are not, because they're planning their next speech, or they're doing research, or they're writing a note, or they're writing a directive or a resolution or something like that. So they may not be paying the most attention they possibly could. So in this situation, people will pay the most attention to you when you begin speaking and when you finish speaking. So often the stuff in the middle is where they're going to zone out. If you have 45 seconds to speech, they'll listen for the first 10 seconds and the last 10 seconds, and the middle 25 seconds they'll probably zone out. And so these should be the most memorable parts of your speech. So when you're structuring your speech, you want to make sure that you begin strong and you finish strong. So your first sentence could be a really interesting piece of research or a joke or something that'll grab people's attention. And then as it wanes, that last sentence is very important as well. So you finish strong, and often the last sentence is your direct call to action, or your specific proposal, or where you make a your big your big final move there. And then another way to keep your point memorable is to make sure that it has one big point. If you're speaking for 1 minute, you should be able to have a one sentence distillation of what this speech is about. So usually that's your specific introduction or your specific rebuttal, as I said earlier, based on the two kinds of speeches I drew out for you guys. So you could have a speech about let's say a tactic to defeat the Boko Haram. Your speech should just be about that one idea. You shouldn't be saying, and that's why I think this is a good idea. Also, we need more funding. Also, we should talk about education. Also, we should talk about these things. Try and keep your focus to one point. So that way, if you ask a delegate right after, or you ask the chair, or you ask somebody, and they say, "What was that speech about?" They can be like, "Oh, well, clearly it was about a strategy to defeat the Boko Haram." Something like that. So the thesis of your speech should be instantly recognizable and have a one-word answer to questions about, what was your speech about? Just be like, it was about this, it was about this. It shouldn't be like, oh, I think it was kind of about this, it was kind of about that. Often it's not good to just cram these other ideas in to your speech just because you have the time. It's much better to stick to one topic and do a really good job on it than do a half measure on, 4 to 5 topics. So another way you can make your speech memorable are the fun things, puns, metaphors, acronyms, that sort of thing, because they can often help spice up a drab subject, or help people recall an idea or an action that you want to take. And if it's something catchy, then it'll increase the likelihood that it will be mentioned again, for example. Um, because if you name your resolution the star resolution, people will start referring to it as the star resolution, as opposed to saying the strategic tactical armed response resolution. It'll be easier for them to name. But the thing with these kind of puns, metaphors, acronyms, jokes, these sort of thing, do not overuse them. Do not feel obligated to use them every chance you get. Only use them if they're clear, if they're clever, and if they're well suited to your speech. If you're talking about genocide or murder or some atrocity, it's probably not the best place to make a joke. So definitely something to keep in mind. And also try and read the room, get a sense of how the chair would react to a joke, how the other delegates would react, and if you think that it's not an appropriate time to do it, it's probably not, so don't do it. But these can definitely help, trying to make your speeches more memorable. For example, there was one time where, I was in DISEC, and there was a resolution that was very, very long, and this kid got up and said, this resolution is like a bag of chips. When you first look at it, it looks very full, but when you open it, it's mostly hot air, which is a very good way of drawing people's attentions to a problem with the resolution. And so things like that often can be very helpful in getting people to remember what you said, so people started calling it the hot air resolution, and it was all because of that one kid's metaphor. So anyway, just to recap the 3 ways to ensure that your speech is memorable: use the first sentence, last sentence technique. Make sure that you begin strong and finish strong. Have one big point. A good speech has one big takeaway, and then using puns, metaphors, and acronyms to spice up a drab subject. So next, the other element of a good speech is eloquence. It's fine if it's incredibly well written, it's well researched, it brings up a lot of good points, it even has good acronyms and jokes and all of those sort of things. But if you're talking like this and you can't hear anybody, then it's not going to end up being a very good speech. And so this eloquence is very important in getting your points across. So for one, volume. You need to come through loud and clear. Quiet voices automatically sound more timid, less confident, less imposing. And this doesn't mean that you just shout all the way through committee, but it does mean that you speak clearly and confidently so that everyone can hear you, and often that means just sounding a little bit louder. Additionally, if you're speaking louder, your voice is often harder to ignore, and delegates that have been delegates that have not been paying attention, whether they're because they've been writing or what have you, they can often be jarred back to attention because they hear a loud voice. So the next thing is speed, and this is something I often deal with. The pace of your speech needs to be moderated at a steady speed. It shouldn't be so fast that it's really hard to follow because you're talking really quickly and it's just difficult to understand, It shouldn't be at that kind of pace. That's ridiculous. And it shouldn't be too slow, so it sounds like you don't really know what you're talking about and sounds kind of boring. What you want is a good, steady pace that keeps in mind timing and how much you have to say, So if you have 45 seconds and you get to the 30-second mark and you have 15 seconds left and you have a lot that you have to say, then you want to speed up a little bit. But if you have the time, you should be speaking clearly and slowly the whole time. And finally, it's important to sound confident when you speak. And so that's a combination of volume and speed as well. But it also means speaking with strength, with little and it's fine to be nervous, and I know that's something a lot of first-time delegates really struggle with, but try and not sound as nervous as much as possible. And so sometimes this means finding another way to express those nerves. One thing I do is if I feel really nervous, I'll try not to sound like it, but I'll just tap my hands like this, or I'll do something with my hands, find a way to get out that nervous energy. So another quick recap: the third element of a good speech is eloquence, and that includes volume, speed, and confidence. Putting those together, even if your speech is not organized and not well researched, it'll sound like a really good speech if you're speaking loudly, you're speaking at a moderated pace, and you speak with confidence. All right? So finally, the last element of a good speech is organization. So a speech should be organized. Even if it's on one topic, it shouldn't be jumping all over the place in terms of its ideas. So think about a causal chain when planning out your speech. This is the problem that I'm trying to solve. The root of the problem is, inadequate funding. So the way to change the problem and make it better is increase funding, and the way we want to increase funding is to do this. So it should be easy for the audience to follow along when they're listening to your speech. And it's important to have that causal chain to avoid these gaps in logic and use transitions wherever necessary. So the next good organizational element is having a clear beginning, middle, and end. So much like writing an essay, you want to think about the flow of your speech. The audience should know where you start, where you're going, and where you end up. You shouldn't have a big introduction and then nothing else. No middle, no conclusion. So it's very important that your speeches are organized in this regards. So the next thing is using your timing effectively, and that often is determined by what the speaking time actually is. So the three most common times in moderated caucuses, speakers lists, what have you, are 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and 60 seconds, or 1 minute. And it's very, very important to feel comfortable with this time because it's extremely important to your success in Model UN. Feeling comfortable with this time maximizes the effectiveness of your speech because if you know exactly how much time you have, you know how to budget it, and you know how to get the most out of your speech. So this is very important, and an exercise I would encourage you all to do is to, get a random topic, just challenge yourself. Like, say you're going to talk about what's better, coffee or tea, and say 30 seconds, and just without looking at a watch or anything, speak for as long as you think 30 seconds is, and then stop and see how close you were to actually only speaking for 30 seconds. Because then if you're familiar with what 30 seconds feels like, you don't have to look at the clock, you don't have to look at the chair, you'll know how to speak, and you'll know, like, in your head, okay, I'm coming up on 15 seconds, I should probably switch and start talking about this now, or begin talking about my solution, or begin ending my speech. And so you can do that with 30 seconds, 45 seconds, 60 seconds. And this makes sure you get the most out of your time, because sometimes if the speaking time is 30 seconds and you really need a lot more time, you have to decide very quickly, what to continue talking about and what to stop talking about. Or if you have 60 seconds sometimes and you don't need all of it, it's sometimes embarrassing if you only speak for 20 seconds of 60 seconds. So you want to make sure that if you have 60 seconds, or if you have more time than you need, you're taking advantage of that extra time you've been given. So whether it's quickly coming up with another idea or finding another talking point, it's very useful for that. The standard time is 60 seconds for those of you that are asking, by the way. And it's usually up to the chair. So the next thing I want to talk about is the gavel tap. Most chairs will tap the gavel when there are 10 seconds left in a speech, just to let you know that you're coming up on the end and you only have 10 seconds left, so finish up your idea. And this can often throw off the best delegates, because they get into the swing of their speech, they get into where they're going, and then the chair goes, and then all of a sudden they're really flustered, they have no idea where to go, and it can really throw people off. So when you hear the tap, what I recommend you do is wrap up your sentence as quickly as possible. Finish that sentence and get to your one big point. You have 10 seconds, leave your lasting impression on committee. Your main consideration there is just finishing strong, So it's important there that you don't get distracted by it. Additionally, you have to kind of be aware of your chair's strictness. You have to decide whether they'd be okay with you going over a couple seconds, or whether if you hit the 1 minute mark, they'll immediately cut you off. Do not push your chair's limits. See if they would be okay with you, finishing up your sentence, that sort of thing, but do not push their limits. Another activity I would encourage you guys to do is, perhaps if you have a partner that you can train with or something, they give you a topic to present on, and the trainers will tap a gavel at a random point, at which point you have 10 seconds, and you have to finish your speech. And doing this is very, very good practice for, adjusting quickly and figuring out exactly what 10 seconds feels like and how to get to your big idea, regardless of what you're speaking on. So, kind of wrapping up a little bit before we get into questions, speaking is one of the most important skills to develop in Model UN, and ultimately, practice does make perfect. Students that should practice these activities and stuff I've been talking about to improve their skills, and much of this learning is experiential. So for those of you that are first-time delegates, your speaking ability and your grasp of timing will improve. The more conferences you travel to, the more times you do Model UN, the more times that you participate in activities like this. And then the other thing I want to leave you with is that speaking is often a zero-sum game, which means that any time that you are not speaking, it inherently means someone else is speaking. So use as much of your time as possible, because the more you speak, the less other delegates get to speak. So with that in mind, do not fill up your speech with random filler. Only speak if you actually have something to say, and you must make every second count. Alright, so let's get to some of the questions. So first, if you just want to type them in the chat, any kind of questions about public speaking specifically, not about Model UN, just about the topic of my webinar that I'm doing right now. And I can answer them. And then we'll do general questions about Model UN or about HMUN India. Okay, so there's a question about, here, we'll go one question at a time. I know that we have to speak solution-oriented, but if we need to, how much can we insult, cite a mistake of another country without getting gagged? So in regards to that question, you should never insult a person. Like you should never say, like, that guy sucks, that guy, like, smells funny, that guy's suit looks weird, anything like that, because that gets a right of reply, and that also doesn't reflect well on you. It's always okay to attack the idea, especially if it's in your country's policy to do so. Like saying, like, I really disagree with this idea, my country doesn't think this is the right solution, I don't think this is well thought out, that sort of thing. But you never want to appear so negative that you're just, like, harping on this idea, that you're just constantly cutting them down, because that makes you look unlikable in committee, and other delegates won't want to work with you. So it's important to, look at, not be afraid to attack another country's idea, but only within a reasonable amount. And then I just want to reiterate that you should never be attacking the person. Like, you should never call someone stupid. You should never call someone an idiot. You can criticize the idea as much as you want, but leave the person out of it. Okay? Trying to see. Are there any other questions about speaking specifically? There will be mics and GAs, to my knowledge, so that your voice carries. So volume may not be an issue in that regard. So yeah, if you're in a general assembly, you should have a mic to which to speak. Okay, we got a question. While speaking, does it make a difference that we refer to our notepads and recall points? I think that generally speaking, it does look better if you're not looking at your notepad continuously to remember points and you have those points in your head. However, if your speech will really be improved by you having access to refer to your notepad, then I would recommend you go ahead and do that. Because it's the quality of the speech that's ultimately important, and so if you're not using your notepad and you give a bad speech, that's worse than using your notepad and giving a great speech. So sometimes, for a lot of people, if you're using your notepad because you have your ideas there, you're less nervous because you're not worried about forgetting something, and so if that helps you become a better speaker, then go for it. But I think you want to make sure that you're still speaking, you're still addressing the room. That if you have your notepad, you're not just going, you shouldn't be just reading off of it. Like, it's good to have there as a reference, but it's not something you want to rely on fully. Okay? We got a question: when speaking, would you recommend looking at the chair or the other delegates? I think generally speaking, you should try and look across the room as much as possible and make eye contact with the chair and with as many delegates as possible, just so that you're not speaking to one area. I've seen so many delegates who just come and just look directly at the chair and are just like, hi, 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 listen to me, listen to me. And that's not what you want to be doing, because ultimately the people you're going to have to work with are going to be the other delegates. So what you want to do is make sure that you're looking around, you're constantly making eye contact with different people, you're addressing different areas of the room if you're in a big GA. And so I think that's important. It's just important that your attention is evenly distributed. We got a question about how to maintain your calm while speaking. Often that's something you have to figure out for yourself. It's important to, I think, breathe before you speak, get the nerves out. And I think the best way to remain calm while speaking is be prepared, know exactly what you're going to say, know how you're going to say it, know how much time you have, how much time you're dealing with. And that'll help make you feel less nervous because you know exactly what you're going to do, and so there's less to be afraid of. Okay, we got a question. When we blank out and have nothing to say to answer a question, what can we do? Can we answer later? Ideally, you're not going to blank out completely and not have anything to say. But I think just presenting, if you don't have an answer, saying that is often okay as long as you present it in the right way. Like if you say I don't necessarily have the answer to that question. There hasn't been a lot of research on that subject, so I don't know. Or perhaps another country would be more able to answer this question than I have. The idea with a lot of speeches in Model UN, even if they're tricky or difficult, or if someone asks you a tough question, you don't want to just be like, you never want it to appear just completely confused or out of the question. So try and keep your composure. Other questions? So there's a question in the general speakers list. If we yield time to other delegates and they ask a question, are we allowed to not answer that question? So generally speaking, when you yield, you can only yield once. So if you yield to another delegate and they ask a question, that is going to end the speech. So when they ask that question, the only way you can respond is if there's enough time left for you to respond. So if you're worried about answering that question, don't leave them a lot of time to ask the question. If you're in a speakers list for 1 minute and you yield at 50 seconds, the delegate is only going to have 10 seconds to ask their question, so there may not be any time for you to respond. At HMUN, is the use of personal pronouns allowed? Generally not. You generally want to go saying, like the representative of this country, or saying that this country feels that, just to make it a more accurate simulation of what would go on in a real United Nations committee. Like you wouldn't have ambassadors being like, well, I personally feel that, because they're not saying their personal feelings, they're articulating the feelings of their country in a certain situation. So I wouldn't use personal pronouns. The question of, do we always have to go to the dais to speak in committee? If you're in a large committee, definitely you'll have to go up to the front of the room and address everybody. But if you're in a smaller crisis committee or even an ECOSOC, depending on how the room is set up and how many people are there, you may be able to speak from where you're sitting, if you just want to stand up and speak, or sit and speak to the rest of the delegates. There are a number of questions about how aggressive of speeches people can give. Can we be aggressive speakers? How aggressive, non-aggressive do you think you should be? I think there's a difference between being a strong speaker and being an aggressive speaker. You should be a speaker that presents their ideas clearly, in a courageous and confident manner. But you don't want a speaker that is aggressive, that is going to annoy people, that is going to deter people from working with them, that is overly negative. So I think it's important. You should be strong and, be confident when presenting your ideas and go after the solution that you want to go after, but don't do it in a way that cuts other people down too much or, alienates people and potential allies. So we're getting a lot of questions about non-speaking stuff, so we'll just shift to that a little bit. So yes, there is veto in the Security Council. It is not considered undiplomatic. All of the P5, that is, the United States, the UK, France, Russia, and China, can all veto. Any other questions? Okay, so the question was brought up, if you're representing a specific person, are you not supposed to use personal pronouns then? If you are representing a specific person, if you're in like a historical committee or a different role, then it is okay to use personal pronouns. Just in the question of the European Commission, you just want to be careful. Like if you are representing like Hans Holbau of Germany or somebody, even though you are representing that person, you're technically there as a representative of that country. So just be sure that if you are representing a country, you articulate your points as the representative from that country, as opposed to your personal feeling. If you are just representing an individual, like for example at HMUN India, there's going to be a Indian cabinet, about partition and stuff. So if you are representing an individual, then it's okay to just use those personal pronouns. There's a question about note passing. Yes, there is note passing, and that's a good way to communicate with other delegates so that you're respectful while other people are speaking. You're not speaking. But if it gets ridiculous, if people start sending inappropriate messages, most chairs will limit note passing. So, how will a double del be assessed? So they'll be considered as a pair. Like it's both of them must be participating. If one delegate is doing all the work, and one delegate is just remaining silently, then that doesn't look very good on the double del. What we really want to see is both of the delegates there helping each other out, working together, getting their point across. But working together doesn't necessarily mean doing the same thing. You can have one delegate that's outside of committee helping write resolutions, talking to other delegates, and one delegate that's in committee speaking and doing parliamentary procedure and that kind of stuff. But it's important that they work well as a team. How important are position papers? Position papers are important. It's your first encounter with the chair, and they want to see that you've done some research and that you've put in effort to figure out what your country thinks about a certain issue, how they feel about it, how they'd like to go about it. I wouldn't say they're the most important thing. Obviously, your participation over the 4 days of the conference is far more important, but don't slack off on your participation. And yes, if you do not turn in a position paper, you can't win awards because you will be disqualified for them. There's a question about compromising too much. So I think compromise is important in MALA-UN, and you're not going to be able to do anything if you don't compromise, because if every nation got what they want, that would just be impossible, right? Because sometimes what one nation wants is exactly what another nation doesn't want. So compromising is important. But I think the key is compromising within policy, so if it's something your nation or your individual would be willing to accept, then you should definitely compromise. But, like, if you are, Lebanon, you shouldn't be making a resolution with Israel about peace in the Middle East, like, you should be working with your allies, like, you should be trying to stick to policy as much as possible. North Korea is probably not going to be working with South Korea, like that sort of thing. Will there be crisis in the Security Council? Yes, of course. How many? I'm not going to tell you. When we're speaking at the dais, can we walk around? Yes, within reason. There's probably going to be one area in which you're limited to, and it's probably okay to pace around a little bit. But, it's not a theater performance. It's not a movie. You shouldn't be doing all these grand gestures and moving around too much. It should all be reasonable. And also, you don't want to be distracting to anyone speaking. What are the other questions? Do we have to leave the committee room to write resolutions? Generally speaking, yes. In big general assemblies because laptops cannot be used in the classroom or in the committee room, excuse me. So generally those get written outside of committee. It's not no laptops at all, but generally you can't use laptops inside the committee room. So you often have to go outside. And I would say in crisis committees and in ECOSOCs, you won't even really need a laptop because generally your resolutions aren't going to be as long, and you also have fewer people there, so a paper resolution or directive works just as fine. What are other questions? Oh, God. There are a lot of questions about research. Oh, yes, there will be Wi-Fi during the conference. The hotel will provide Wi-Fi. But so as for research, you know, I think it's a combination of doing enough research about your country and about your topic, you know. So even if your country is not directly related to your topic, you should know enough about both that you can speak intelligently about both. So if you are, you know, let's say, like Latvia or Lithuania, and you're talking about the melting of the polar ice caps, you know, like there is not a lot that Latvia has to say about, you know, what's going on with global warming, right? So what is important to research there is looking up, you know, what Latvia thinks about a lot of things. You know, what is the size of the economy? What's the GDP? What's the political situation like? What do the people want? That sort of thing. And then also understanding the topic. So, like, why are the polar ice caps melting? Why has there been no good global warming action taken? That sort of thing. And then finding a way to connect it to. Because sometimes your country will have a very clear position. You know, like if you're talking about ISIS and you're America will have a very clear position. It'll be quite easy to do research about what America feels about ISIS, and you know, like, so that research is very easy to do. But sometimes you won't have that clear connection to make. So in that case, it's very important to really know what your country thinks, if not specifically about that issue, just in general, so that you can make an assumption about what they would do in this situation, and then learning as much as you can about the conflict or the topic. Trying to see what other questions. During crisis, can we pass directives and communiques? Generally, yes, but a lot of this stuff is going to be up to the chair. The chair will probably take some time at the beginning of the first committee session to explain to you how the crisis stuff is going to work at the beginning of the committee. You know, whether they want directives and how long they should be and how many sponsors and stuff those would need. Any other questions? If you're part of the press, the way you should prepare is, like I said, learning about your outlet. So, you know, if you're the New York Times, learn as much as you can about the New York Times, their style of writing, what they could do, and also be familiar with how these topics are treated in that sort of thing. So, there's a question about does DISEC have crisis? Probably not, because it's a General Assembly. There's a question about electronic gadgets. Generally not allowed, but that's up to the chair's discretion. So some chairs might be okay with you having gadgets, some chairs might be not. But they'll make that very clear at the beginning of the first committee session. There's a question about being contradictory to your policy. Generally avoid that. If your country doesn't have a specific policy on an issue, then you can kind of do whatever you want because there's nothing to contradict. But as much as possible, you should never contradict your international policy. You're contradicting your country's policy because that's not the point of Model United Nations. You know, it's presenting your ideas. If every country presents their ideas, that's how you have a spirited debate. That's how you reach a comprehensive solution on a lot of issues. Any other questions? I will allow you to complete the last sentence of your speech if time runs out, but nothing more than that. There's a question about, do we have to cite our sources of information during our speech or only if someone asks? Generally, you don't have to, but it's often helpful if you say, a recent study by, the University of Andhra says that this, something like that. Because that's often helpful for people to know where your research is coming from and where this statistic is coming from so that they know you're not just making it up. Good question. There's a question about using laptops in the Security Council. Laptops will not be allowed in the Security Council. UNEP will probably not have crises. They may have one or two, but like I said, your chair will explain how those will work if they're going to be included at the beginning of the first session. There's a question about if it's international policy, can you contradict your country's policy again? In the example of, if I'm the USA, can I support ISIS? If you are the USA, you definitely cannot support ISIS. You should not contradict your country's policy, even if international policy is different. So, do not support ISIS. Any other questions? There's a question. For all of you that have specific questions about the United Nations Security Council, my email is unsc@hmunindia.org. I would recommend you just email me those questions there, because this is supposed to be a webinar more generally about HMUN India and those kind of speech. Okay, can you make up statistics for a futuristic committee? Generally not. If you read the background guide, the background guide should fill you in on what has happened between the present day and the future, and those are the statistics that you should be using. So don't just make up statistics, Don't just change the frame of the debate like that. But yeah, for all of those of you with specific Security Council questions, I would recommend you just email me, because I am here to answer more general questions. Elaborating on crises. Crises are real-time updates that happen in your committee. If you're discussing, let's say the situation in the South China Sea, as you're discussing it, you might get a crisis update, which is where someone comes in and updates you on the situation. So they say, China has just taken this action, or Japan has just taken this action, or whatever, and you as a committee are supposed to react to that. So you can do that with a directive. You can do that by adding another clause to your resolution, that sort of thing. Any other questions? I'm posting the link for the, so I posted my email in there, unsc@hmunindia.org, and this is the link for the YouTube page, and that has all the videos. So they have stuff about, working papers, they have tips about security councils, there are tips about general assemblies, rules of procedure, ECOSOCs from all the different directors, messages from the Secretary General, messages from all these people, so I would encourage you to look on there. What do I look for in a delegate? I think the thing that I look for most in a delegate is this passion from AutoUN, so they're really, they encourage other delegates, they participate, They try to get everybody involved. They're really having a good time. They're enjoying themselves. They've done their research. They're really trying to get the most they can out of it. So they should, like, I think what I look for is someone who is like really there to have a good time. They're not going to be mean. They're not going to be rude to anyone. It's very important to me that delegates are well behaved and are polite towards other people. So it looks like there are some issues with the links. If you just go to YouTube and look up HMUN India, you'll be able to find whatever you want. And like I said again, my email is unsc@hmunindia.org. So hopefully that's helpful. What is a press conference? In certain committees, members of the press corps, which is another committee in itself, will come and ask you questions about what you are doing, what is going on, just to report what you're doing to the outside world. In the same way that the real press is meant to be accountable and like let the people know what is going on in the meetings of the Security Council or of the meeting of whatever committee is there. So if you get singled out in a press conference and caught by a good reporter, this question has just been asked. Ideally, this is where your preparation comes in handy. So if you get called out specifically, you should have a good answer. That sort of thing. Because if you're prepared, then any question won't catch you off guard. It won't be too strange for you to answer, and you'll have at least an idea of something to say. And like I said, there's no shame in not having the answer and just being like, I'm sorry, I don't know. But the key is keeping your composure and not freaking out, just understanding, thank you, that's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer. It's something that requires further research or that we're currently working together to solve, something like that. The Security Council may have a press conference. We'll see about that. You're in the UNDP and you haven't received response from your director from the week. I'll talk to your director about that. Press corps delegates can ask things in between sessions and off but generally not in off committee time. Once committee ends, you're free to do whatever you want, and members of the press are probably not going to ask you anything. But during committee, when you're working on a resolution or something, if you're outside, they can definitely talk to you. As to what you should wear, Western business attire is the official dress code of HMUN India. So generally, if you're for guys, you should be wearing suits and ties. For girls, nice dresses or pantsuits, that sort of thing. You guys are generally good on this stuff. Don't wear anything too scandalous or revealing, and you should be fine. Any other questions? If you have committee's specific questions, I would recommend that you email your director about questions for your subcommittee. They can answer that better than I can. While solving crises, what exactly do you pass? So once again, that's going to be dependent on your director. Some directors may say that, okay, you should just add this to your resolution, find a way to deal with this in your larger resolution. Other ones will say, okay, we have to deal with this right now. You need to pass a directive, which is a shorter version of a resolution that only has operative clauses. So that's going to be up to the discretion of your chair. Any other questions? Some tips on debating resolutions. Like I said, always argue from logic. So you never want to attack the person, you want to attack their idea. So it's important to find what the logical flaw with their idea is. Like say the delegate is not considering the human cost of this, or the amount of resources it would take to do this, or the sustainability of the solution. This would work temporarily, this would not work in the long term, something like that. So it's important to keep that in mind when debating a resolution, and always have a something to hang your hat on, a reason that your resolution is always the best. Like mine is the best because it's the most comprehensive. It's the best because it's the most long-term solution, or it's the best because it gets the most countries involved. Any other questions? Alrighty, guys. Well, I gotta go. I gotta get to work, but it was a pleasure meeting you all. I'm excited to see all you guys very soon in August. And like I said, please feel free to email me if you have any further questions. Like I said, it's unsc@hmunindia.org. I will try to get back to those as soon as possible. And have a great day, guys. All right, bye-bye.